Okay, so now we're going to create a form component to add a contact to our state. And we're not dealing with our API at all. We're just dealing with hard-coded data. But the component stuff isn't going to change much once we start to implement our API, because all that stuff's going to go within our state, within our our contact state. So right here, this is where we'll be making all of our requests, and then we'll basically dispatch to our reducer what we get back, and then it'll get sent to the components. However, the components aren't going to change much once we start dealing with our back end. So let's go and create a new file under components contacts, and let's call this contactform.js. All right, we'll go ahead and scaffold this out. So this contact form, it is going to be used to add and update contacts, but we're not going to add the update functionality until a bit later. We are going to have to bring in context to be able to call the methods and stuff like that. But for now, we just want to get the form displayed before we do anything else. So up here, let's bring in use state, because since this is a form, we do need some component level state for each field. So let's go up above the return here. And right above the return, I'm going to go ahead and say const brackets contact and set contact. Now, instead of setting each field to its own piece of state, like, you know, set name, set email, set type, and all that, we're just going to have a single piece of state called contact, which will be an object with all the fields. So name, email, phone, and type. And type, I'm actually going to give a default of personal. All right, now we can actually pull these values out of contact. So let's pull out name, email, phone, and type from contact. And now we can use that down here. So let's structure out our form. I'm going to actually return a form directly. And inside the form, let's have an h2 with the class of text primary. And we're just going to say add contact. And then under that, let's put an input. Type is text, and let's add a placeholder. This is going to be for the name. And let's do a name, which is also going to be name. And let's do a value, and the value is going to pertain to the piece of state, which is going to be the name, which is going to be this right here, which is this. Okay, and then we're going to have an onChange that's going to call a method called onChange. Okay, so I'll save that, and then we're going to just pretty much do the same thing for the rest of the fields. So let's do email. So let's make this type email. It gives us that built-in validation. Placeholder, actually for placeholder, let's put uppercase here. All right, and name is going to be email. Value is going to be the email part of the state, and it's going to have the onChange. Okay, so again, let's put in one for the phone. Now we also have the type. Type is going to be a little different because it's they're radio buttons. I'm actually going to put an H5 here and say contact type. And we're going to have an input with a type of radio. Okay, the name is going to be type, no ID. It's going to have a value. This one's going to be personal. And then we want to have a checked value. So basically, if the current type is personal, then we want it checked. If it's professional, then we want the professional button checked. So let's go ahead and we know that it's personal by default. So by default, we want it to be checked. So we can simply say if type is equal to personal, then this one will be checked. Okay, we also need a label. So after the input, let's go ahead and just say personal, and then I'm just going to put a space here like that. Okay, and then let's copy this. And then this one is going to be for professional. So I'm going to select both of these and say professional. Checked if the type is professional. Let's change this as well. Okay. And then the last thing we need is a submit button. So let's go right under here, and let's do a div. And in here we'll have an input with the type of submit. Value, we'll say add contact. And let's give it some classes. So BTN, BTN primary, and let's do BTN block. Okay, now we need to create our on change, which has the same idea as, you know, when we did the on change in the GitHub project. Basically, we need to put whatever we type into each of these fields into that part of the state. Now, our state is just a single contact, which is an object, so we need to target the specific item to change. So let's say const on change takes in an event parameter, and we're going to say set contact because we're changing this part of the component level state, and we called this set contact. Now, it's not like it's a single form field where we can just put in a string. We have to put the object in and do a couple things. One, we have to copy the rest of the state or spread it across. So we'll use a spread operator with contact. So whatever is in the current state. And then we want to take the current value that's being, you know, changed. If we're typing in name, for instance, then the key here should be name. If it's email, it should be email. And we can actually get that through the name attribute by doing brackets and then e.target.name. What that'll do is it'll look at whatever the value of this. So name, email should match the value of email. So these should match because that's the key. And then the value is whatever we type in, and we get that with e.target.value. So let's save that. And that should be enough for it to just display. So let's go into our home.js and let's bring in the contact form. And go down here where I have this comment and get rid of that. And put in contact form. Okay, so we'll save that. And there we go. So now we have our contact form. So let's see, and you can see personal is checked by default. Now, when we submit this, we want to add to our contacts. We want to add to our state. So we're going to have to deal with the context. So in our component, in our contact form component, let's go ahead and bring in our context. So import context, and we want context, and then we have to initialize that. I'm going to go right here and say const contact, set that to use context, and pass in context. Now use context is a hook, so we have to bring that in. So now we should have access to any methods or state, and the reason we need this right now is because we need to have a function or a method called add contact. Okay, right now we don't have anything happening with this form, so let's add a submit handler here. We'll say on submit, and let's set that to on submit. All right, and then we'll put this on submit right here. let's do. Okay, and then in here we're going to prevent the default. And then we need to call a function called add contact. Now we don't have that yet. We'll create it after, but let's say contact context dot add contact, and then we can simply pass in contact, which is our state, which is all of our form fields. And then I just want to clear the form up, so I'm just going to call set contact and pass in our object. And I just want everything to go back to the default, so I'm going to copy this, paste that in like that. Okay, so once our form is submitted, it's going to look for this function right here, add contact. And where we put this is in our state, our contact state. I actually have a placeholder for it. Now, ultimately, this function is going to reach out to our API and actually add it to our database. But for now, we're just adding it to the UI. So let's create a function. It's called add contact, and it takes in a contact. Now, remember, when we add to MongoDB, it adds an ID for us. However, we're not using MongoDB yet. We're not using our backend. So I'm actually going to use that UUID component or package that I installed and brought in to just generate a random ID. So I'm going to say the contact that's submitted, let's add an ID to it, and we can get a random ID by just doing UUID.version4, which is a method. Okay, and then we'll simply dispatch to our reducer the type, which is going to be add contact, and the payload, which is going to be our contact. Okay, and like I said, later on we'll be making requests to our back end. So let's save that, and now let's go to our reducer, which has nothing in it yet, and let's start to create this. So I'm going to actually import, let's see, we need a bunch of types, so I'm just going to copy from right here. Let's bring in these types to our reducer. Yeah, that should be good. And then we'll create our function. So export default, and this takes in state and action. And then we want to have a JavaScript switch to look at the type, so action.type. And we're going to have a default case here that's just going to simply return the state. Okay, now let's add our case of add contact, and when that happens, what we want to do is return the current state, and then for contacts we want to just add the contact. Now we can't just change contacts. State is immutable, so we have to copy what's already there, and we can get that by using the spread operator and then state.contacts. And then we want to add our data, which we sent in the payload, so we can add action.payload. Okay, because if we look at, let's see, right here, we sent, the contact comes in, and we're directly sending it to the payload. Later on, we'll make a request to our backend, get a response, and send that to the payload. But there's very little change that we'll need to do when we implement our backend. So let's go back to our reducer, and let's make sure that we save this. And what this will do is it should update our state. It should update the contacts and add it, and we should see that reflect in the UI. So let's try it. And we'll just say Ted Jackson. Doesn't really matter. This isn't going to stay because it's not going to get saved to the database or anything. We'll say professional. Okay, so we can't choose professional for some reason. Okay, so I know I add contact isn't working, but let's figure out why I can't choose professional. I don't think I added the on change. So back in the contact form, let's go down to here, and no, right, we didn't add the on change. So let's make sure we add that here because these are controlled components. Okay, so if I save that, we should be able to check professional. Now the reason the add contact didn't work is because in contact state, we created it right here. However, we didn't add it down here to our value. Whenever we want to access anything through a component from our context, we need to add it here. So we just do add contact. So now hopefully it will work. There we go. Ted Jackson, email, phone, professional, good. So he's now added to our state. Now if I reload, it's not going to stick because we're not saving it anywhere. It's just getting added to memory. Now I'm going to open up our React Dev Tools here. Let me just make this a little bigger. And let's see, let's go to React. And we should see our contact state and then our context provider. And in value, you can see now we have our contacts, which has an array of 3 values, these right here, and also our method, our add contact. Okay, so we can now add a contact to our, basically to our UI. Now in the next video, I want to do the delete because that's pretty easy. We just basically need to link up our context and call a method and delete it, send it down through the reducer. And then after that, we'll work on the update, which is a little more complicated because what I want to happen is when we click edit, we want to basically set a current contact, and that should get added to the form. And we want the form to change up in a couple ways based on if it's an add or update form. Okay, so in the next video, we'll get to the delete and then we'll work on the edit.